Good morning. Hi, John. Good morning and welcome to St. John's Dean's Forum. Please come on up. We're not live yet, but please come on up and have a seat. We are going to get started very shortly. Prizes for sitting in the front. Couple of rows. Actually, for real, in the fall, some people won a free book just for sitting up front. Because on our live stream, it really does look kind of sad if they can't see anyone, and they can only see the front couple rows. So be brave. Come on up. We won't bite. Thank you, Cheryl. I know the pressure, peer pressure. Happy New Year. Welcome back. We're so glad you're all here. I'm Tina Clark. I am the Director of Christian Formation here at St. John's Cathedral, and I am so excited to kick off our spring Dean's Forum lineup. If you have not yet taken a look at the spring lineup, you can do that on a poster on the wall in the hall outside here. You can pick up the green Dean's Forum and Formation flyer, which is at most of our entrances. And you can also see it online at sjcathedral.org under the tab Learn. We've got some great speakers coming this spring, and I'm so excited to greet all of them. And I think you'll really enjoy the series that we're putting forward. So thank you for being here. And we're kicking off with a fabulous duo, two of our own parishioners who are also brilliant and smart and funny and just delightful. Dr. Tony Alumkal from Iliff School of Theology and Dr. Sandy Dixon from DU and also partly from the Joint Doctoral Program. You're the assistant director, I knew I was going to mess it up, assistant director of the Joint Doctoral Program between DU and Iliff. So very quickly we'll open in prayer and then I will hand it off to these wonderful people. The Lord be with you. Almighty God, thank you for this beautiful morning. In this new year, bring us to the brightness and the understanding and the wonder of the Epiphany. Be with us as we learn and grow and continue to form ourselves and our faith together in community. In the name of your Son, our Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen. So, Dr. Sandy Dixon and Dr. Tony Alumkal.
Sure. Hello. Good morning. I am Tony Alumkal. Again, I teach the sociology of religion at the Iliff School of Theology. Hopefully, most of you remember our retired colleague, Greg Robbins, who was the canon theologian here at the cathedral? So I'm more of a loose canon theologian. So we'll see if I ever get invited back to speak again. So Tina asked us to say a little bit about ourselves and how we got into this business. So it makes it sound like the mafia. Like, how'd you get in there? Yeah. So I am the child of immigrants. My father's from India, and my mother's from the Philippines, and they met at Montana State University. So obviously it was meant to be. So my father was studying chemical engineering, got a PhD there, and then took a job at DuPont. So I meant that I spent most of my childhood in Wilmington, Delaware. Now, if you grow up in Wilmington, Delaware in that time, you get a strong message. The best thing you can possibly do with your life is be an engineer, right? Now, I guess some people got a pass. Joe Biden somehow got a pass. George Thorogood and the Delaware Destroyers. I guess if you're bad to the bone, you get a pass. I didn't get a pass. So I went off to college at 18 to study electrical engineering at UC Berkeley. And that lasted about a semester. But it seemed like there was more exciting things being discussed on the campus than electrical engineering, at least for me. And engineers weren't my people. So every time I read the Dilbert comic strip, I'm like, that could have been me. But I got out. So I ended up majoring in sociology. Wasn't sure what I was going to do with it when I graduated. But then junior year, I took a class in the sociology of religion with Robert Bellah, who was one of the great sociologists of religion. I was interested in religious questions because at this time I was an ex-Roman Catholic who was trying to find where I fit in the American Christian landscape. So I was interested in religious questions and I was interested in sociology. So the sociology of religion is looking at how religion operates in society. So for me, it's like, this is perfect. This is what I'm interested in. So from there, I decided, okay, I'm going to go to grad school and study this. Applied to grad schools, got into Princeton University, where Robert Wuthnow, another one of the great sociologists of religion, was teaching. The Lilly Endowment had just dumped a bunch of money there to start the Princeton Center for the Study of American Religion. So it was a perfect place, perfect time to me to be there. Did my dissertation, then went on the job market and saw an ad for some quirky United Methodist seminary in Denver called Iliff School of Theology. Never heard of the place, but I was intrigued by the idea of teaching at a school of theology, so I applied and they hired me, so I've been here ever since the fall of 1999.
Wow, that was really interesting. I didn't know all this, and Tony and I have been colleagues since 1999. I'm Sandy Dixon. I'm the chair of the Department of Religious Studies at DU, and as Tina said, assistant director of the joint doctoral program between DU and Iliff. My title and my area of expertise is psychology and religion in the Department of Religious Studies. I got into the field because I grew up in a family that was very religious, as one would say. We went to church every Sunday. We opened the joint. We closed the joint. We were there during the week for committees and this and that and the other. We also had our share, I would say, of unhappiness. And one way my father dealt with that was to be very interested in what he called newspaper psychology. Right? In other words, he wasn't a psychologist, he wasn't going to be a psychologist, but he read about almost everything he could about psychology. And we talked about these things, and these things were talked about in our church. Well, I went off to college thinking that I would become a psychologist and have a tidy little practice, married to somebody who was really earning the family living, and that this all seemed good. And my college, which was Bryn Mawr College, treated psychology as a natural science. So I did lots of different kinds of experiments and so forth, and loved it, just loved it. But I thought before I became a psychologist, I should venture off into the world and find out a little bit more about the world. And when I was about 2 years out, actually, I had gone abroad for a year, and then I came back and was hanging out with my brother in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and met a Harvard law student whom I haven't seen in the however many decades since, who actually said to me at one point, "The only thing you've ever talked about with enthusiasm is theology." I was like, really? Huh? What? So I thought about it, and I thought, well, dang, he's right. So I started looking around for schools where I could study theology in the way I wanted to. My mom was busy becoming a pastor, and I felt like I shouldn't be on her territory, and I didn't think I wanted to be. So I ended up at the University of Chicago, which studies religion very intensively and has a long history of not paying a whole lot of attention to the ministry. The ministry people there would hate it that I say that, but the emphasis really is in a different direction. So I went there thinking that my interest had changed, and I would study religion and literature. And I started reading, and I realized that for me, every novel was a life that I had to think and live. And the people in religion and literature were reading 4 novels a week. And I was like, okay, I'm not in the right spot. But they had a religion and psych program, and that's where I found my home. And when jobs came open, first of all, there are not a lot of jobs in religion and psych, so you know all of them. The grapevine is... and I applied for the one here and ended up getting it. It was a little more circuitous than that, but I've been here since 1992. All right.
All right. So we're going back and forth. So I'm going to talk about 3 major trends in American Christianity from the standpoint of sociology of religion, and then she's going to talk about what she sees going on from psychology of religion. So let me run through these three major trends. So the first one is that there is a steady decline in the percentage of Americans who identify as Christian, and a steady increase in Americans who identify as having no religion. People sometimes referred to as nones, N-O-N-E-S, because you ask them, what is your religion? And their answer is none. All right. So there's a handout that might be out there somewhere. This is from Pew Research, which does a lot of these, a lot of survey research on American religion. So if you see a chart that looks like this, this is on page 2 of the report. We have between 2007 and 2021, you see Christianity declining from 78% of the population down to 63% of the population, so 15% decline in that time period. Then no religion, or nones, we see going from 16% up to 29%. So they're approaching a third of the population, and this is a couple of years ago. Maybe they're going to get to that point by now. But we're seeing a steady increase in people who identify as having no religion. Now, when they start breaking down the Christian groups to see, okay, who's declining, who's not, and look on the other side of the chart. Within Christianity, recent declines concentrated in Protestantism is the name of the chart. So you see Protestants declining in this time period from 52% down to 40%, so a 12% drop in this time period. Catholics are holding about steady, a little bit of a drop, 24% to 21%. Now we need to keep the Catholic one in some context. The Catholic Church benefits from two things demographically. One, they have a pretty high birth rate. Second, lots of immigrants who come to the United States are Catholic. If you took away the immigration piece, the Catholic Church would be declining, right? So they're losing members. They just have new members showing up to almost replace them, right? But beneath that surface, they're losing a lot of members, right? They lost me, so okay, that's a big deal. So that was a while ago, though. Now, there's another chart. We don't have it here, but they looked further and said, okay, within Protestantism, who's leaving? In the 1980s, the story was mainline churches like the Episcopal Church, United Methodist Church, etc., were declining, and evangelicals were growing. Now, evangelicals are declining as well. So both evangelicals and non-evangelicals are declining, right? So that's a new thing. The black church seems to be holding steady. Just the group of people who identify as black Protestant, that number is actually holding steady. But evangelicals are now starting to decline. So let's see. Okay. So why is this happening? What's going on that's making Christianity decline and is making the nones increase? Now, sociologists have identified there's kind of a main factor, and then there's some secondary factors. The main factor causing the decline of Christianity and growth of non-affiliated people is a backlash against the Christian right. So the Christian right started in the late 70s. They picked up steam in the 80s under the Reagan administration, continued on. And then in the early 90s, kind of a big flashpoint was the midterm elections, 1994. This is Bill Clinton's first term. Republicans take both houses of Congress for the first time in generations. And Ralph Reed of the Christian Coalition claims victory and says, we did this. This is us. Now we are in control of Congress. And now, not everybody was happy with this, of course, but a couple of messages. This is the high point of the Christian right. A couple of messages they put out to the public. One is, the only real Christians are conservative Christians, conservative evangelicals, conservative Catholics. These are real Christians. If you're not one of these, you're not a real Christian, right? That's Ralph Reed, or you're not serious. So Ralph Reed put that out. And if you're a serious Christian, you'll vote Republican, right? So so the message, in other words, is Christianity equals conservative Christianity equals the Republican Party. That was the message of the Christian right. And they had a big platform and were constantly putting this message out there. The media starts replicating this message, not because they're Christian right supporters, but because the media is so inept at covering religion that they just repeat whatever's handed to them, right? So, and I could go on that. Don't even get me started, Howard. Don't even get me started on the Denver Post. But anyway, so the Christian right starts referring to faith voters. Faith voters are people who support the Christian right. The implication is if you're not supporting the Christian right, you don't have faith. Okay. Then mainstream media outlets start doing stories on faith voters, right? Implying if you are not a Christian right member, you don't have faith. The Denver Post did this about 10 years ago. I did an article on faith voters, and you look, and it was about evangelicals and conservative Catholics. So the media starts replicating this message. So again, Christianity equals conservative Christianity equals the Republican Party. Now, once this message gets out there, people then say, okay, if I don't like the Republican Party, then I guess I don't want to be Christian. Then you start seeing in the 90s this sharp uptick in people dropping out of Christianity and saying that they have no affiliation. And when you dig down, what is it they don't like about Christianity? It's they don't like the Republican Party, right? So you see this polarization where it's the Republican Party and conservative Christianity, and then people who more lean Democrat are more likely to be non-religious affiliated. So that's the cause of this trend. The main cause of this trend is the backlash against the Christian right. Now, there's a couple other secondary factors feeding into the growth of the nuns or no religion population. Another one is the internet. Pre-internet, imagine you're in a small town, everyone around you is an evangelical. You're having doubts about evangelicalism, but you don't have anyone to talk to about it. Internet comes in, just Google ex-evangelical, boom, you got all these people talking in stories about why they left evangelicalism, and that's going to encourage you to leave. Ditto if you're a Mormon in Utah and everyone in your town is Mormon and you're having doubts about Mormonism, who are you going to talk to? Pre-internet, you didn't have anyone to talk to. Internet, now you can just Google ex-Mormon and you've got people to talk to. So this is, researchers think this is contributing as well to the decline in religion. And then the third factor is that the decline of religion encourages more decline of religion. When everyone goes to church, back in the 50s, there was a lot of social pressure. You're supposed to go to church if you're a good American, right? And if you have children, you're supposed to take them to church, right? So, with the baby boom population, hey boomers, sorry, just couldn't resist. I'm Generation X, Kurt Cobain generation. With baby boomers, a lot of them, they were taken to church as children. They dropped out, most of them as young adults. But then a lot of those people, when they got married and had kids, they came back to church because, of course, you're supposed to take your kids to church. What kind of person doesn't take their kids to church or synagogue? That expectation's not here anymore because there's no longer, the percentage of people going to church is no longer at that threshold. There's no longer expectation that you're supposed to go to church. So the decline in religion feeds on itself because it then erodes the expectation that you're supposed to go to church. And if you're raised non-religious, you're more likely to be non-religious as an adult. So this trend of increase in no religion is going to keep increasing then into the future as it's going to cascade down across generations, right? So that's trend number one then, decline of Christianity, growth of nuns. A couple things I want to say before I move on to the second trend. If you look worldwide, Christianity is declining in the United States, Canada, and Europe. Basically, countries where a lot of white people live. So Christianity is not declining in the global South. It's not. So anyone who says Christianity is dying or Christianity is declining hasn't looked at the global scene. What we're seeing is a shift in the geographic center of Christianity. Historically, it was Europe, and then Europe and the United States, now shifting to the global South. So it's not Christianity is dying, it's shifting, right? So and I hear people say Christianity is dying. No, it's not. Even in the United States, then, Christianity is declining. It's not disappearing anytime soon, okay? So, and Christianity still has incredible cultural, social, political influence. So, talking about Christianity dying in the United States, even that's premature. We know in the short term, decline's going to continue. No one knows what the long-term picture looks like. No one can predict the future. Sociologists who try to predict the future never get it right. So where are we going to be at the end of the century? Nobody knows, right? So also, if anyone says Christianity is dying in the United States, even that we don't know what's going on. All right, let me talk about the second big trend that's going on, and that's the rise of white Christian nationalism in the evangelical world. Now, before I talk more about evangelicals, the thing I always say to my students, evangelicalism is very diverse. And so you have to be careful about saying evangelicals believe this or evangelicals do this. Evangelicals all over the map. You can talk about most evangelicals are doing this or most evangelical leaders believing this. But you need to be mindful that there's lots of varieties of evangelicals. And there's no clear boundary of where evangelicalism begins and ends. It's not a denomination like the Episcopal Church that has a membership. And researchers don't even know how to identify who's an evangelical and who's not, because there's no perfect way to get at this, because a lot of average people don't know religious terminology. They know they're a Christian, they know they read their Bible, but what kind of Christian are you? They have no idea what they are. Even the word Protestant now is like, what's that mean? So that makes it really hard for surveyors. So what Pew does is they ask you, are you an evangelical or a born-again Christian? That's their way of identifying. But what does that even mean? People don't necessarily know what those terms mean. So even identifying who's an evangelical and who's not is fuzzy. So I wanted to throw that out there before talking about the evangelical world. So not all evangelicals are supporting white Christian nationalism. But a lot of evangelicals, a lot of people who call themselves evangelicals are. And this is growing, and this is one of the big trends. You might have seen the statistic that in 2016, 83% of self-identified evangelicals voted for Donald Trump. Maybe you've seen that. And when this caught the attention of scholars who then said, okay, what's going on here, and started digging into what is it about Trump that evangelicals like, and things that came up was Christian nationalism, the idea that Trump was going to help make the United States a Christian nation. Didn't matter what his personal behavior was like. What mattered was, what was his policy going to be like? He's going to make the United States Christian, that's good enough for us. The xenophobia that was very obvious in the Trump campaign, that was actually a selling point, not something that detracted them. In other words, they wanted a xenophobic president. So let's dig into these two terms, Christian nationalism and white nationalism. What do these mean? First, white nationalism is the idea that whites should dominate the United States, which means anyone who's not white should be a second-class citizen or know their place or be small in their numbers. But in any case, the United States should continue to be dominated by whites. Now, this is obviously not a new concept. I mean, if we're honest, this is what the United States, one of the founding principles of the United States, which justified slavery and justified taking of land from indigenous people. But the history of the United States has been about slowly moving away from this. So any resurgence of white nationalism represents a step backwards from the progress we've made, especially since the Civil Rights Movement. Christian nationalism is the idea that Christians should dominate the United States, that the United States is or should be a Christian nation. The United States was not founded on this principle. Several of the key founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine, Ben Franklin, were deists, not Christians. John Adams was Unitarian. I'm not sure how Christian he identified with. But the United States was not founded as a Christian nation. But the idea that it was a Christian nation is something that's popped up over time, every once in a while. The new evangelical movement, or neo-evangelicalism, which started in the 1940s by Billy Graham and others, that one was very much had Christian nationalism in mind. So the new evangelicalism or neo-evangelicalism, it broke off from fundamentalism over the issue of how separatist or how isolationist should we be. Billy Graham thought fundamentalists were too isolationist and not confronting American society. He wanted to bring them kind of out into the mainstream more. Theology stayed the same, but it was more a matter of strategy. But neo-evangelicalism was very much a product of the Cold War period. For Billy Graham, the United States was in a war against godless communism. We, Christian America, have to win this war. God is on our side, so we will win this war, right? So very much this idea of the United States as a Christian nation. Billy Graham famously didn't back John F. Kennedy because, God forbid, a Catholic would become a president of the United States, right? He eventually got over that. But at first, he was like, we can't have a Catholic president. This is a Protestant country, right? So that's the mentality of the early evangelicalism. So you combine Christian nationalism and white nationalism, you get white Christian nationalism, which a large percentage of evangelicals are supporting. So why is the upsurge? Why is this becoming popular? The United States is becoming more diverse, both racially and religiously. But the key thing is, now this diversity is reaching parts of the country that are not used to dealing with diversity, right? So like big urban areas like New York, Los Angeles, they're used to dealing with religious and racial diversity. But now the diversity is getting to parts of the country that are not used to dealing with that. And a lot of white Christians are panicking. It's like, we're losing the country we know, right? The country we know is slipping away. We don't like this. We want this to stop. And then the white nationalist message becomes appealing, therefore, as a way to counter that. Let's see. The other question, I guess, is why evangelicalism in particular would be susceptible to white Christian nationalism. Now, as we mentioned, Christian nationalism is kind of baked into evangelicalism. That's not new. But why would they be open to white nationalism? If you think about I've spent a long time studying the evangelical world. There's evangelical theology, and most of us know the basics of that. The Bible's an infallible book. You need to accept Jesus Christ as your personal Savior, etc. Alongside evangelical theology, there's evangelical culture. Evangelical culture is built strongly around this idea of us versus them. We are moral, they are immoral. They, liberal, secularists, are controlling the culture. We should be controlling the culture because this country was founded as a Christian nation, right? So, et cetera, et cetera. So evangelicals have a sense of themselves as a marginalized, embattled religious minority. Now, the reality is they actually have an enormous amount of political power that they're not acknowledging. But their self-perception is, we're marginalized, we're embattled, we should be dominating this country, we're not, right? So the strong sense of marginalization, us versus them. Originally, this is applied to religious issues, but it's not a big leap to apply it to racial difference, right? If your mentality is, we need to take this country back for Christianity, it's not a big leap to, we need to take this country back for white Americans because we're being overrun by people who are not white, who are changing the nature of this country. So that kind of opens the door for white nationalism to be an influence on evangelicalism, even though there's no inherent connection between evangelical theology and white nationalism. One more thing I want to say about white Christian nationalism before moving on. To some extent, this is kind of bubbling up from the grassroots, from ordinary Americans reacting to their experience. But that's not the whole picture. White Christian nationalism is also being pushed on Americans from the top, so to speak. There are conferences devoted to either white nationalism or Christian nationalism. There are think tanks coming up with messaging to push white nationalist or Christian nationalist ideas, which then get fed to right-wing media like Fox News. this costs money, right? Organizing costs money. Who's putting up the money for this? And the answer is there's a small number of billionaires who are putting the money in, including Charles Koch, the surviving member of the Koch brothers, who are funding white nationalism and Christian nationalism. Now, you might think if people are funding this, that means that they're strong believers in this. That's not how the political playbook works. Here's how the political playbook works. What Charles Koch and billionaires of his ilk want, more than anything, are tax cuts for billionaires and deregulation of corporations. No politician can run on that as a platform. No politician can say, my platform is I want to cut taxes for billionaires and win an election. They can run on culture war issues, like I'm going to protect your children from critical race theory that's shaming them. I'm going to defend your right to own any kind of gun that you want. I am going to protect your children from competing against trans athletes, et cetera, et cetera. All these culture war issues we're hearing in the media. The purpose of these is to divide and distract Americans. Because when Americans are divided and distracted, they're not paying attention to who's getting benefits from tax cuts and who isn't. Think about the last election cycle. How much discussion you remember about the current tax structure and whether it's equitable or not? There was almost no discussion. That's not an accident. It's because culture war issues were taking up all the oxygen in the room, so to speak. That's the playbook. Push culture war issues to divide and distract Americans so no one's paying attention to the tax code. So white Christian nationalism becomes one more culture war issue that can be used to distract Americans. And that's why billionaires are underwriting this and trying to push this into the conversation, into the media, in order to distract Americans. So, real quickly, I want to talk about one more trend in American Christianity. And this is a trend that's going across lots of institutions, and that's the transition from in-person only interaction to hybrid in-person online interaction, right? And this was going on, this transition was starting before the pandemic. The pandemic accelerated it. During the lockdowns, interaction had to be online. Churches had to put their services online, had to put meetings online. When the lockdowns ended, there's still an expectation of maintaining some kind of online presence, right? And churches are still figuring out how do we do this? What kind of presence do we need? How much resources do we give to this? The good folks at Hartford Institute of Religion Research are currently doing a project on the effect of the pandemic on churches. In a couple of years, we'll know more about how this looks like. What we know already is a lot of churches are maintaining an online presence. And we at St. John's, we're doing that right now. We're live streaming on YouTube and Facebook. So we'll see where this goes in the future. So I think I said enough. Let me hand it back to Sandy.
Okay, great. When Tina started talking to us about today's Dean's Forum, she was saying we want to get some sort of idea of what the U.S. and by implication Denver and St. John's is looking at in terms of the religious landscape and what psychologists and sociologists might have to say about that. And in one way, Tony's just done the perfect job. I'm sure in every way Tony has just done the perfect job. But of setting this out, and this really is the bailiwick of the sociologists. What are the big trends that we're all looking at and that we have to face? Some psychologists do this, but the kind of psychology work that I work with tends to try to look at what are the processes as people think about things, as their feelings come into things, as they decide what behavior to act on and act on it. What are those processes that might be interacting with this big social scene? And the one that came to mind for me instantly is the notion of schema. Now, I've been reminded really, that those of you who work with children in the educational system have probably heard of this before. According to psychologists, a schema, and I'm going to read this just to try to make sure I say it correctly, is a mental representation containing organized prior knowledge about a specific aspect of our lives. So it's prior knowledge that's organized. It's not just a fact here and a fact there, but it's organized. We know the specification, even if we can't say it all the time, we know the specification of the relationships between the bits of knowledge. And I was worried about what example to use, and then just as Tony's talking.
You have to bring your mic closer.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. As Tony was talking, I was thinking about how he was giving such a perfect example of schemas, right? Because he used a bunch of words that we may think of in a particular way that other people think of in a different way. So, for instance, if you bring forward the idea of what is a Christian at St. John's, we might say something somewhat different from what the evangelical church is saying. We're not going to worry quite so much about whether somebody can claim to be born again. We don't think that a Christian has to believe that the Bible is literally true. Nobody here preaches that way, right? So when we say Christian, we have a certain kind of prior knowledge. Sure, we think the Bible is important. Sure, we know that there's a story about being born again. Sure, those are all part of being Christian. Nice. You talk to an evangelical, what is it to be a Christian? Not only do they think that those things are part of it, they think they're central. And they think they're the grounds on which you can exclude somebody else from being Christian. As somebody who teaches religious studies in a university, I often have to go over the idea that Roman Catholics and evangelicals and Lutherans and Episcopalians and Methodists, etc., are all Christians. Because not only do the evangelicals think that non-evangelicals are not Christian, but Catholics think that non-Catholics are not Christian, and a lot of Protestants think it's something about a church, right? So I have to kind of go over this. And so this is an example of a schema. What knowledge do you have organized? What are the relationships between the pieces? And then we need to know, as we think about this complex situation that we're in, a little bit about how schemas operate. So from the psychological point of view, and they're the ones who came up with this, a schema operates automatically. We don't sit down and say, okay, we're going to talk about Christianity and the situation facing Denver today, and say, now what schema shall we choose? Tony and I are experts. We didn't do that. We start sifting through the things that we know. What can we present in some way where you can grasp a picture and have something to move forward with? The mind just does it. This is just how we work. So they work automatically. And schemas also work quickly. Again, I mean, sometimes we're stumped, but what a psychologist would say is, if you're stumped, it means you don't have a schema for it. You're trying to build the organized knowledge. But if you've got the organized knowledge, it just comes popping right out. And this is great stuff, right? I mean, if we were at St. John's every Sunday saying, goodness, now where shall we start? How shall we look at the Bible? Exactly how literal is it? We would have a hard time communicating. And we would miss out a lot of what's going on in a lot of the wonderful sermons we hear, where they explore the Bible from lots of different perspectives and help us think our way into that. All right? So schemas are super useful. But as you can see from the way I've put it and from what Tony said, they can also cause a lot of miscommunication. Because I think one of our schemas for communication is that we say words in a particular order because we're trying to make a point, and anybody who knows our words and understands English will understand what our point is once we've put those words in that order. But once you put in schema, what you realize is that each of those words is kind of a constellation of concepts and inferences and relationships between ideas. So that when we're talking, it's not one sentence meeting one listener who then responds in one sentence. It's almost like a burst of ideas over here that this person is picking up in their own bursts of ideas over here and responding back the same way. Okay? So, in other words, there are loads of ways for all of this to go wrong. In addition to which, our schemas aren't always right to begin with. Okay, you can, and all of us do. We have lots of schemas that are wrong. And you can, the way a psychologist would hear this is when somebody comes up to somebody and says, I never thought of it that way before, but that makes a whole lot more sense than what I was thinking. Okay. Translation, I had a schema, it didn't work very well, now I've got yours, that works a lot better. But one of the tricky things also here is that schemas tend to be stable. That is to say, it's easier for us to try to pull something into our own schema than to change our schema so it takes on a different shape and includes something new. The psychologists call this, we tend to assimilate into our schema rather than accommodate our schema to them. So I'll give you a little example, very homey example. I was talking to my niece the other day. That's sort of a complicated family layout, but we won't worry about that. And she was saying that she had spoken to my great-nephew about her own mother and her mother's very conservative views on certain things, including religion. And her son had no idea. He's in middle school, right? So this is a time when you're growing into new knowledge of your family and people are telling you things that they didn't tell you before. And he was like, wait a minute, my sweet grandma thinks that gay people shouldn't be in the church? What? Well, his sweet grandma, she's a wonderful person. And she is very, very Christian conservative. So she would say that she loves gay people, but that to be in the church, they need to let go of being gay. And my great-nephew can't process this at all, right? So he's got a schema that we might be familiar with, that the church is inclusive, and he knows his grandmother is in the church, and he can't understand then how she would also be exclusive and also still nice. All right? Well, and of course, he's in a position to see her as nice that some other people might not be. But, I mean, if you met her in the grocery store or whatever, you'd have a great time talking to her. So one of the questions then is, how do we deal with each other when we're bringing whole systems of ideas into each communication and quite possibly misunderstanding each other, and also are confronted with how difficult it is to really change that automatic organization, fast-moving way of thinking. So Tony may be here just to keep it, to keep us moving. I'll go ahead and say that one possibility is to keep growing in awareness that when we're talking about a whole complex of things. And I know, being an academic and working in this field, I can think about that fairly often. But there are other times when I say, wait, how could somebody possibly mean blah, 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 you know? And I've got all this apparatus that tells me very much how somebody could be thinking something different. But I still have that gut reaction that my schema is right, it's clear, it covers things, and what is the matter with the way that person thinks? All right? So if I could remember at that point that I'm not responding just because I'm right, I'm responding because I've got this pattern that's going, and maybe what I could do, if indeed I want to understand how that person could think that, is to get a little bit more clear about my own pattern, what's going off in me, and then also think, okay, wait a minute, they're bringing a constellation of ideas here. What might those be? And can I ask about them? I think we're not always the right person, the right time, the right place to open a huge discussion of this, but at least it could get us a little bit past what the heck are we going to do about them, right? And instead say, okay, we've got a field of communication to open up here to try to understand what's going on and how to move forward. Do you want to go ahead with something, Tony?
Sure. Yeah, we have more to talk about than we have time for, and we want to leave time for questions. So let me just quickly talk about some of my ideas. So how do we respond to the current situation that we're in right now as Christians? Number one, I'd say we need to get away from this idea that growth equals success. The Bible never, ever teaches that faithfulness to God or faithfulness to Jesus leads to popularity. Quite the opposite, in fact. Jesus is quoted in the Sermon on the Mount as saying, "Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward in heaven is great, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." Doesn't sound like a path to popularity there. So, we need to get away from this idea of growth equals success, because that's more American culture and capitalism. That's not what the Bible says. So Christianity is declining in the United States and will continue to do so. We shouldn't say, okay, this is a sign of failure. There's something sick about our churches. This says nothing about the health of our churches. It's more about what is the culture that we're operating in. So we need to be aware of that. I would say that we should actually embrace the decline and look for the positives in it. The term mainline, which is used to apply to the Episcopal Church, United Methodist Church, United Church of Christ, non-conservative Lutherans, etc. The term mainline was coined because in the 1950s, this was the religious establishment of the United States. Now, in the Bible, God generally doesn't speak from the centers of power. God tends to speak from the margins and the wilderness. So if the mainline churches are moving from the centers of power to the margins, for me, that's actually a good thing. I guess you can tell, like I said, I'm a loose cannon theologian. I guess you can tell I'm a little on the radical side. For me, like being on the margins is actually where you want to be, not in the center. So if that's happening, I'm not alarmed at this at all. I guess the third thing I would say, the non-Christian right Christians need to find better ways of communicating who we are to the public. We can't rely on the news media, because the news media is useless in terms of covering us. We're going to have to figure out maybe how do we use social media in more creative ways. I don't know how to make a TikTok video, so don't ask me, and I can't dance, so that's, if it were me dancing on TikTok, that would probably destroy the Episcopal Church. So yeah, you don't want that happening. So we got to find creative ways to use social media to communicate who we are. There are people out there who genuinely don't know that there's such a thing as non-conservative Christianity. That the only Christianity they know about is the Christian right. So at the very least, we need to let them know that there's other options and let them know, so what do we stand for exactly? So we need to find ways of communicating. So
I'll just build on that for a second. I mean, in a sense, what Tony's been telling us from the psychological point of view is that the schema that's most available about Christianity in our society at this point is this view of Christianity as evangelicalism. Okay, and so how are people going to form a different schema if that's all they're hearing? Right? So that's part of where we come in. How do we use the media, and how do we, again, get clear about what our constellation of beliefs is? I think that's part of the reason you're here this morning, right? I mean, not that we'll tell you your beliefs, but this is a place to explore that. It's part of the reason that we go on down and worship. And we get lots of different inputs into our schema from our worship, right? A lot of us, I think, have a schema of Christianity that doesn't remember that part that Tony read from the Sermon on the Mount. Yeah, we don't spend a lot of time about, well, are we being reviled and persecuted, and does that show that we've spoken in Jesus' name? We don't go there, right? But it's part of the huge schema of Christianity, so where does it belong in ours? Can you hold on just 1 second? And then we'll, and so then the other challenge, I think, is that in all of this, God may be calling us to bridge a gap from the psychological to the theological. God may be calling us to change some of our schemas and to become more aware of the ones that are around us. And I think a lot of those calls are at the margins. And our associate clergy, or whatever, is ready with a question.
I just want to say Tony Alumkal was one of my seminary professors, so he's used to my stupid questions. But the thing about persecution, though, when you were saying it, I was realizing, I mean, there's a lot of feigned persecution on the part of white nationalism and Christian nationalism. I mean, they really believe that they're in the right and that they are persecuted and that everything is against them. And so it's a very perilous path when we talk about, like, are we being persecuted as a sign of, do we have favor or God's endorsement in our little projects?
I think that's very important because, as I said, part of the mentality of evangelicalism is we're a marginalized, persecuted group, when in fact, they have a veto power over who gets a presidential nomination in the Republican Party. So they've got a lot of power. They don't want to acknowledge it. There's a saying going around, when you're used to dominance, equality feels like persecution. Right? I don't know who said that, but I think that's what it's getting at. Yeah.
Thank you. This has been completely fascinating, so thank you. I wonder if you could make just a small comment about another aspect of Christians/Christianity, and a group that has its own schema and is very happy with its own schema and is a big part of who we are as a nation, as the presidential, as Romney's presidential nomination proved, and that's the LDS.
And that's what?
LDS.
Oh, so the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, so yes, I mean, it's in a way, it's a perfect exemplification of schema, and also because there is the grounding in a lot of the teachings of Christianity, and yet from a psychological point of view, one would say that back with its founding, there was a vast accommodation of that schema to new inputs, and that those then have moved so that and I don't know the faith well enough to speak perfectly clearly about this, but there's a status that's granted to the Book of Mormon that most of us just could not accept. And so that would be a place where the schema is different. We might say they have a book that they consider equally important, but in our view of Christianity and its development, that book does not belong in the schema. Is that any help? Okay.
My question is for Tony, and I was wondering if you could comment on class divisions and how they apply to the growth or decline of Christianity in different places. So two things you talked about were the decline of Christianity in countries like the United States, Canada, and Western Europe, which are all relatively wealthy parts of the world, whereas the global South is not as wealthy. So what role does class division play in the growth and decline of Christianity relatively? And then secondly, you also talked about the rural-urban divide in the United States. How much of it is, how much does Christian nationalism appeal to white people in rural areas because they're inherently racist? Or is it more of a fact that they're living in desperate economic circumstances and therefore turn to, I don't know how I would describe it, like dramatic, like religious values? Yeah, does that make sense? Yeah.
So, I should know this. My number crunching skills are a little rusty, but yeah, I should know about class and how it contributes to religious decline. So, the the growth of non-religion is especially taking off among people with high levels of education. It's a little more complicated than that, because if you look at evangelical churches, you also have people with high levels of education and also high levels of income. So in a sense, I guess the best thing I'd say is that this stuff is cutting across class boundaries. There's not a clear class location for people becoming non-religious or people staying within Christianity. Now, see, your second question is about kind of white nationalism in rural areas. I mean, I think that a lot of that it has to do with the political playbook that I mentioned, that you want to divide and you want to distract Americans. And racism, since the 80s at least, or probably prior to that, I mean, that's been one of the main tools used by politicians to how do we distract Americans so that we deliver economic policies that don't help them. And, I think that certain politicians have done a very good job of reaching into rural America and pushing this distraction. And I think other political leaders have neglected rural areas and have lost the opportunity to dialogue with them and say, no, this is not what you want. This is not in your interest. This is not helping you. So I think this is partly explains why white nationalism has taken off in a lot of rural areas, is because it's about political strategy and going in and using that to divide them and getting their votes to deliver policies that don't actually help rural areas.
If I could add to, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
After you.
Okay, thank you. So I'll try to do this quickly. I think another thing that is tricky here is that for a lot of us who are white, who grew up in the U.S. in the late 20th century, there was a time when being for integration, we would have said, was a matter of saying, we will let all the people of other colors and backgrounds be like us. And it's been quite a shock to quite a few people to say, they don't necessarily want to be like us, all right? And so part of the problem there is that, again, we've got these schemas going. So our view is they want to be like us. Well, in some ways they may, like if we have enough money to feed our families and put a roof over our heads. And in other words, they may not. Okay, so that as we've gone on, in the cities and so on, we are more exposed to all these different variations, but in the rural areas, people may not be, and also some racists in cities may not be, because when you say, okay, we've agreed that these people can be like us, when they don't want to, it feels like a real blow, right? Which psychologists call hot cognitions. Schemas are about cognition and how we think. That's a hot cognition. They don't want to be like us. What? All right. And that's some, I think, of what's going on. Okay, sorry, please.
Yep. A lot of what I think I'm hearing you talk about in the future of Christianity and religion has to do with institutional schemas. The way that churches see themselves, the way that religions see themselves, and so on. But my sense is, or my understanding is, that roughly every 500 years or so, the schema of religion, the schema of Christianity, tends to go some transition, some new insights, some new ways of being, some new dimensions of revolution or recovery, whatever the case may be. A lot of people now are saying, I'm not religious, I am spiritual. That is a different shift in schema. And what is happening within the scientific community or the astronomical community, gives us new insights that transcend our predecessors in terms of foundation for understanding and for formation of schema. As we look towards the church, as we look to where we are right now, which is in the 500-year pattern, as I understand it, where transition begins to take place, what can we look at in terms of the schemas that might evolve that affect the institution of Christianity and our understanding of who we are spiritually and who we are together?
Wow, that's a great question. Yeah, and no time and way more of a crystal ball than I've been granted. But a couple of things that I think of are, for instance, as you were talking, I was thinking about, okay, there's our own wilderness service, right? So it breaks out of the Sunday morning part of worship schema. It brings in different kinds of music. It allows different kinds of physical movement and so on during the service and participation. Those, I think, are some things you see them in evangelical churches quite a bit, where there's often several bands all coordinating different kinds of music, a lot louder, a lot more personality being shown than we show in our church. Our clergy are vested the same, right? And in some of these churches, it's all about the pastor's personality. So these are different models. I'm not saying we should become necessarily more like them, but I am saying that there are ways in which we can think what seems to reach people in different ways. I also think, again, that one of the things that I would love to see as part of this turn is that we see church in all of our mission work. And I don't mean necessarily direct conversion. I mean, when we're thinking about what is the role of St. John's in the city, we are thinking about, do we have a substantial group working at the St. Francis Center? Are we carrying things to people in need? Migrants are being shipped to Colorado. What are we doing? And I'm saying, who has their hands in bags full of clothes saying, is this the right size for a teenager? I think those are the kinds of places that I would like to see Christianity as we move forward. Okay.
That will preach. I think that's a perfect place to end this morning. Thank you all so much. Tony and Sandra are here at St. John's. We're so blessed to have both of them here, so you can corner them with more questions as you see them around. But thank you so much. Please join us next week. Bishop Dan will be in conversation with Dr. Sheila Devaney, and you can get more information about that forum on all the places that I mentioned earlier on the website and in the Dean's Forum flyer. Thanks for being here. We will see you at 10:30, both in the cathedral and on the live stream for our choral Eucharist.